after the Civil War, when feral longhorns in Texas were roaming the plains in huge herds, cattle barons hired 20,000 itinerant soldiers, newly freed slaves, Mexicans, and drifters to drive the cattle to railheads in Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska. They're called cowboys. Cowboys were responsible for catching their own mounts, and they culled these 8 to 20 horses per man for a trail drive from the wild horses that ran in the mountains and plains. After the horses were caught, they had to be tamed and trained. In those days, the practice of taming a wild horse entailed roping the animal around its neck, tying it to a post, and gradually reeling it in until the saddle could be put on the animal's back. But the horse was by no means gentle. When a rider was seated in the saddle, the horse was untied from the post. As soon as he was let loose, the horse would bog his head and boil over, doing everything in his power to unload the rider. The job of the rider was to stay in the saddle as long as possible, for a horse that knew he could throw his rider just would never stop trying. This process, so many hundreds of times repeated, accumulated a distinct vocabulary. When a horse started to buck, it hit its head and kicked the lid off, boiled over, broke in two, came apart, folded up, kettled, shot its back, slatted its sails, unwound, hopped for mama, wrinkled its spine, or wrapped its backbone and hallelujah'd all over the lot. When a rider grabbed the saddle horn to stay aboard, he was choking the horn, clawing leather, grabbing the nubbin, grabbing the post, pulling leather, reaching for the apple, shaking hands with Grandma, squeezing the biscuit, squeezing Lizzie, hunting leather, or demonstrating safety first. When a horse finally relented, stopped fighting, and settled down, a cowboy would say he'd gotten the horse smoothed or ironed out. Such horses would be taught to come to a standstill when a calf was roped, to move backwards or forwards or sideways when asked. They'd be used on the range to herd and sort cattle, mend fence, go to town, haul hay. They'd be ridden over the mountains to a Saturday night lodge dance, or go fishing on Sunday afternoon. These trained horses were known as broke horses, or broken. The process of breaking a horse required strength and agility, persistence and patience. Some men had a talent for staying in the saddle long enough to get a horse ironed out and working. These men, known as bronc busters or bronc peelers, were held in high regard. The riding skills needed to stay aboard green horses, as well as the roping skills necessary for catching, doctoring, branding, castrating cattle, became a focus of competition among the cowboys. Teams or outfits of cowboys came together after the roundup to test their skills against one another, competing for petty cash or a new set of clothes. They competed in roping and tying a calf, in preparation for branding or doctoring, roping a bull by its head and feet in preparation for castration and branding, and riding an unbroken horse. Occasionally, other events such as horse racing were added to the competition. A cowboy with a unique talent such as fancy roping or trick riding might show off for the assembled crowd. By the 1880s, the railroad extended all the way across the country, and it was no longer necessary to drive cattle north to Kansas or Nebraska. Ranchers and homesteaders fenced off the range and imported a new breed of cattle, the docile Hereford from England, which would easily be tended to in a small space by a handful of men. When the Herefords got fat, they could be driven or trucked to the nearest railroad. Cattle barons kept a few cowboys on their crew to tend the cows and hired extra hands seasonally for spring and fall roundups, or when there was work to be done. Small ranches branded, castrated, and calved their own herds with the help of a few hired hands or neighbors for whom they would return the favor. Most cowboys found themselves unemployed and some hungry for a meal or perhaps a bit of fame hired on to a Wild West show started by the entrepreneurial Colonel William F. Buffalo Bill Cody in 1872. Western melodrama had become a popular form of entertainment from Chicago to New York, down the eastern seaboard and abroad in London. The original Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show and Congress of Rough Riders, otherwise known as Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, was a performance of Life on the Range, featuring riflemen and rough stock riders, fancy ropers, and feather-bedecked Indians. Within 3 years of Buffalo Bill's first success, more than 50 shows traveled the country. Despite the travel and performance schedule, life as an actor in a Western melodrama was easier than life on the range. But it was an act. In a Wild West show, the real cowboy played himself on a stage. Meanwhile, the small contests of skill that originated on ranches grew into competitions hosted by local communities. The competition were known as fiestas, tournaments, roundups, stampedes, and rodeos. Rodeo came from the Spanish word rodear, meaning to surround, as in surround a herd of cattle or horses, or to round up, but soon came to signify both the original meaning and the added element of competition. Most of the participants were cowboys who learned their skills on the range. Some worked as ranch hands, some were ranch owners, and some were former Wild West show performers. Unlike the Wild West shows, however, rodeos charged cowboys to compete and spectators to attend. Rules were laid down and prizes awarded. Elements of Buffalo Bill's performance, such as comic skits and novelty acts, were adopted to attract larger audiences. By the early 1900s, the competition drew spectators from far and wide, and several towns were hosting successful multi-day events. From 1900 to 1910, annual rodeos with big prize monies were held at Salinas, California, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Calgary, Alberta, and Pendleton, Oregon. Pendleton, population 5,000, counted a crowd of 50,000 in town for the rodeo in 1913. As rodeos proliferated, rodeo committees formed to discuss rules of competition and conduct, and in 1929 a collective committee named itself the Rodeo Association of America, RAA. Among other organizing elements, the RAA determined a national scoring system, whereby each dollar won equaled 1 point, and the cowboy or cowgirl with the most points at season end could be declared the world's champion in his or her event. Although by 1929 some cowboys competing in rodeos had learned their skills specifically for the performance competitions, most of the RAA's events stemmed directly from the range or working cowboy skill set, team roping, calf roping, and bronc riding. In the 1920s and 30s, a cowboy or cowgirl couldn't make a living wage from rodeo alone, but it was quickly becoming a sort of profession. Rodeo producers secured the venue, hired cowboys to gather the stock, horses, steers, and calves, hired acts to perform fancy tricks between the competition, and hired announcers, pickup men, judges, secretaries, and timekeepers. The producers sold tickets to the public to cover expenses and make a profit. The cowboys paid entry fees that collectively formed the prize money. If a cowboy won enough, it was possible to go from one rodeo to the next, sharing expenses and accommodation with friends. Some husbands and wives went down the road together, and a handful of women bronc riders traveled and performed on their own alongside the men. Within a few years, the popularity of rodeo expanded in unexpected ways. While most small-town rodeos closed during World War II due to the lack of participation, larger rodeos at home, like the Cheyenne Frontier Days, stayed on at the request of the War Department in the name of patriotism, and military bases abroad staged rodeos for entertainment of the troops. Troops came home as rodeo fans and participants, and by the mid-1940s, rodeo attendance was second only to that of baseball. Like Babe Ruth, the cowboy was distinctively American, a perfect post-war patriot icon. The cowboy represented freedom, independence, and justice in the land of opportunity. Almost immediately after the war, cowboys appeared everywhere on television and the silver screen. 30 primetime television westerns were made in the 1950s, and 54 Western-themed feature films were screened in 1958 alone. In the 1958-59 television season, 7 of the top 10 shows were Western, including the top 4, Gunsmoke, Wagon Train, Have Gun, Will Travel, and The Rifleman. These horse operas presented danger and injustice, to which the clean-cut cowboy hero reacted, highlighting his characteristics, strength, patriotism, and masculinity. But the cowboy hero was never a rodeo star. To the contrary, rodeo cowboys were portrayed as immature, selfish, violent, and self-destructive. They were heroic only on a small scale in a specific environment for a short period of time.